Find a shelter. On Christmas Eve, landlord Dennis changed the locks on a black family's apartment, tossing their lease in the trash. He had no idea the woman shivering on his doorstep, her child clinging to her leg, was Judge Rachel Carter, and by morning he'd face criminal charges, ruinous fines, and a court order contacting every single tenant he'd ever had. Her name was Rachel Carter, and she wasn't just any tenant. She was a sitting housing court judge, the very authority slumlords like Dennis spent their careers avoiding. But this illegal lockout on the holiest night of the year crossed a line that would trigger not just a personal fight, but a systemic reckoning. Because when a judge becomes the victim, the gavel falls with a different kind of force. Judge Rachel Carter had presided over housing court for 7 years. She'd seen every trick: the forged notices, the suspicious repairs, the sudden utility shutoffs. She knew the law cold, that in nearly every state, a landlord changing the locks without a court order was committing a criminal self-help eviction. A Class A misdemeanor in New York, punishable by thousands in fines and even jail time. But she'd never imagined her own family would become a case file. She and her husband, Michael, a public school teacher, had moved into the modest 2-bedroom apartment on Oak Street 6 months prior. The building, owned by Dennis, the dealmaker, worked through a labyrinth of LLCs, had peeling paint and a persistent damp smell, but the rent was just within their budget in a city where costs were spiraling. They'd signed a standard 1-year lease. They paid on the first of every month without fail. Dennis Rourke operated differently. A landlord with a portfolio of over 40 properties across the city's working-class and majority black neighborhoods, his business model was a masterclass in calculated neglect. Minor repairs went unanswered. Complaints about mold or leaks were met with silence, or worse, a sudden notice of a steep rent hike. His real profit came from turnover, pushing out long-term, rent-stabilized tenants through intimidation, then renovating cheaply and doubling the price for new, often whiter, tenants. It was a brutal, cynical game, and he was good at it. He'd never been caught because his targets were people who couldn't afford lawyers, people for whom a night in a motel was a financial catastrophe. The trouble started in November. A pipe burst in the apartment above the Carters, flooding their bathroom ceiling. Michael called Dennis's management line daily for a week. Finally, a handyman showed up, patched the plaster with a visible, shoddy smear, and left. The underlying leak wasn't fixed. 2 weeks later, black mold bloomed in the corner. Rachel, holding her 5-year-old son, Eli, who had developed a persistent cough, sent a formal, certified letter citing the city's housing code. It was the kind of document she saw every day in her courtroom. Dennis's response was not a repair crew, it was a text message. New policy. Rent increase starting January, $300 more. It was a blatant retaliatory hike, illegal under tenant protection laws. Rachel replied with the relevant statute number. The next text from Dennis was simpler. You should find somewhere else. This isn't working out. Christmas Eve arrived, brittle and cold. Rachel had just finished wrapping Eli's last gift when the pounding started on the door. Not a knock, a series of hard, aggressive thumps. Michael answered. Dennis stood there, not in the suit he wore to court, but in a puffy vest and flannel, a new brass lock and drill in his hand. 2 large men loomed behind him. "You're done here," Dennis said, his voice flat. "Time up." "Our lease runs through May," Michael stated, holding the document up. "We have a contract." Dennis snatched the paper, gave it a cursory glance, and then, with a slow, deliberate motion, ripped it in half. He let the pieces flutter to the worn hallway carpet. "That's what I think of your contract. You got 30 minutes to get your stuff. After that, anything left is mine." Rachel stepped forward, Eli hiding behind her leg. "This is an illegal lockout, Mr. Rourke. You have no court order. What you're doing is a criminal offense." Dennis leaned in, a smug grin spreading across his face. He smelled of cigarette smoke and cheap cologne. "You can explain that to the cops when they get here for trespassing. Now I'm a reasonable man, it's Christmas." He pulled a $50 bill from his wallet and held it out. "For a motel, or like I said, find a shelter, but you're not sleeping here. The cruelty of the offer on this night with a child present was its own kind of violence. The research is stark. Black women, particularly mothers, face eviction at disproportionate rates, often the targets of these exact predatory tactics. But Dennis had made a fatal, arrogant error. He had never asked what Rachel did for a living. He saw a black family he could push out and assumed they had no recourse. Rachel did not take the money. She looked past him at the new lock in his hand, then met his eyes. Her voice, when it came, was low, steady, and carried the absolute authority of the bench. "My name is Rachel Carter. I am a judge in the housing court for this county. You have just committed a criminal act in my presence." The grin on Dennis's face didn't fade immediately. It froze, then slowly cracked, as if the words were taking a physical path through his understanding. The color drained from his cheeks. The two men behind him exchanged uneasy glances. "You're bluffing," Dennis stammered, but the confidence was gone. Rachel already had her phone out, not to call the police, but to dial a direct line to the courthouse. "This is Judge Carter. I need to speak to the court clerk on emergency duty. Now." She turned her gaze back to Dennis, a controlled inferno in her eyes. "You wanted to play landlord. Now let's see how you play defendant." Within 20 minutes, 2 squad cars and a housing court-martial were on Oak Street. The responding officers, expecting a routine landlord-tenant dispute, froze when they recognized Judge Carter. The script flipped instantly. The marshal, a veteran named Henderson who'd served orders in her courtroom 100 times, handed Dennis the emergency restoration order. It was issued by a fellow judge, awakened at home, who'd heard the facts and needed only 60 seconds to rule. "You will immediately restore the tenants access to their lawful residence. Any interference constitutes contempt of court and further criminal liability." Dennis's bravado had evaporated into panicked negotiation. "This is a misunderstanding. We can fix this right now, Your Honor." Rachel's reply was glacial. "The time for negotiation was before you broke the law. You will comply with the order. Now." He fumbled with the drill, reinstalling their original lock under the watchful eyes of the police. But when the Carters stepped back inside, they found a fresh outrage. In the short time they'd been barred, Dennis's men had been inside. Their personal belongings, photo albums, Eli's toys, Michael's lesson plans, had been haphazardly thrown into garbage bags and piled in the center of the living room. It was a psychological siege tactic, a message: this is not your home. Christmas morning dawned, not with peace but with paperwork. At 9 a.m., from her temporary stay in a hotel room paid for by the court's victim services, Rachel filed a formal criminal complaint with the district attorney's office. The charges were specific: illegal eviction under the state's penal code, a Class A misdemeanor punishable by up to a year in jail, and criminal trespass. But she didn't stop there. In a separate civil filing, she invoked her authority as a judge to request something far more dangerous to a slumlord: a full audit of Dennis Rourke's entire rental portfolio. This was the nuclear option. While a criminal case might end in a fine or probation, a court-ordered audit would shine a light into every dark corner of his business. It would examine every lease, every repair request, every security deposit, and every eviction filing for the past 5 years. For a man whose profit model relied on shadows, it was a death sentence. The story, as these stories do, leaked by midday. A court clerk spoke to a reporter. The headline wrote itself: "Housing Court Judge Illegally Locked Out on Christmas Eve." By evening, it was the lead story on every local newscast. The thumbnail was perfect: a black woman, a child, a smug landlord with a lock. The public outrage was immediate and white-hot. And then the dam broke. Emails began flooding the courthouse's public information office. Then calls. Then people showing up in person with folded leases and cell phone photos. They were all tenants, past and present, of Dennis Rourke. A single mother from a building on the south side, locked out in the rain after complaining about a broken heater. An elderly couple from the east side, whose utilities were cut off in July until they voluntarily left. A young man from a West Side studio, who returned from work to find all his possessions on the curb and a new tenant moving in. The pattern was horrifying in its consistency. The targets were overwhelmingly Black and Latino tenants. The methods were the illegal lockout, the utility cutoff, the retaliatory rent hike. The outcome was always the same: forced displacement without a legal eviction, clearing the way for higher rents. Dennis hadn't just messed with the wrong tenant, he'd provided a live sample of a systemic disease. Rachel, working from her hotel room, coordinated with the city's housing authority and legal aid societies. This was no longer just her case. It was a potential class action civil rights lawsuit. Using the emergency powers of the court, she authorized a temporary freeze on any eviction proceedings Dennis had pending against other tenants. Every single one of his tenants in all 42 buildings would receive a notice from the court informing them of their rights and the ongoing investigation. For Dennis, the financial clock was now ticking loudly. With his ability to churn apartments frozen, his cash flow from inflated new rent stopped dead. Worse, the district attorney, sensing a politically potent victory, convened a grand jury to consider additional charges of pattern and practice of discrimination, a federal offense. But Dennis Rourke was not a man who would go quietly. As the net tightened, he made a desperate call, not to his lawyer but to a private investigator he'd used before to dig up dirt on troublesome tenants. His instructions were simple, vicious, and revealed his true character. Find something on her. Anything. A bad ruling, an old complaint, a speeding ticket. I don't care. If she's going to burn my business down, I'll drag her off the bench with me. The investigator went to work, and within 48 hours, he reported back with a finding that made Dennis's blood run cold, not with fear, but with a predatory, renewed hope. It wasn't dirt on Judge Carter. It was about her husband, Michael. The teacher, Dennis whispered into the phone, a new, ugly smile forming. Tell me everything. The investigator's report contained no scandal. Instead, it detailed a quiet vulnerability. Michael Carter had co-signed private student loans for two of his younger siblings a decade ago. When one lost a job during the pandemic, payments had lapsed. The loans had gone to collections, and then to a little-known subsidiary of a larger financial group. A group that Dennis Rourke's silent business partner, a reclusive real estate investor named Arthur Vance, had a controlling interest in. This wasn't dirt, it was a leash. Dennis realized that through a chain of financial entities, he technically held the delinquent debt of the judge's husband. It was a thread, and he began to pull. His lawyer, a sharp litigator named Ferraro, made the call to Rachel's chambers. The offer was framed in careful, legalistic language. Given the immense scrutiny and the potential for collateral damage to all parties, my client is prepared to settle all matters. He will pay significant restitution to your family and establish a tenant relief fund. In return, we seek the dismissal of the criminal complaint and a halt to the portfolio audit. A clean slate for everyone. Then came the second part, delivered with cold precision. We also understand Mr. Carter has certain private financial obligations that are causing strain. As a gesture of good faith, my client is prepared to have those obligations acquired and forgiven. Entirely. A fresh start for your family, your honor. The message was clear. Drop the case and your husband's debt disappears. Pursue it, and we will weaponize his financial struggle. The attack had shifted from the front door to the kitchen table. Rachel listened in silence. When Ferraro finished, she replied with one question. Are you recording this call? A beat of static. No, Your Honor. Good, she said. Because offering to pay a judge's personal debts in exchange for a favorable legal outcome is felony bribery and obstruction of justice. This conversation is over. She hung up. The threat had crystallized the enemy. This was no longer just about a lock. It was about the entire architecture of corruption that allowed men like Dennis to operate. She called Michael, explained everything. His voice, usually so calm, shook with a mixture of shame and fury. "I'm so sorry, Ratch. I never wanted. I was just trying to help my family." "You have nothing to apologize for," Rachel said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "They are trying to punish us for being human. We don't negotiate with that." But Dennis wasn't done. When the blackmail failed, he pivoted to a public smear. Anonymous packets began arriving at local news outlets and bar association review boards. The packets contained copies of the loan documents, Michael's name highlighted, alongside carefully edited snippets implying Judge Carter's entire campaign against Dennis was a personal vendetta to erase her family's debt. The headline was manufactured. "Judge in heated landlord battle has financial link to defendant's business." For a day, the media cycle churned with the insinuation. Online comment sections turned toxic. The narrative Dennis wanted, an abuse of judicial power for personal gain, began to find purchase. It was at this precise moment of maximum pressure that the audit team, working around the clock in a secured office, found the keystone. It wasn't in the leases or the repair logs. It was in the banking records. The forensic accountant, a woman named Lynn, noticed that security deposits from dozens of Dennis's tenants, often the last financial buffer for working families, were not being held in separate, interest-bearing escrow accounts as required by law. Instead, they were being pooled into a single high-risk commercial account. And that account was being used as collateral for short-term, high-interest loans from a private lender. The lender, the same Vance Capital subsidiary that held Michael Carter's student debt. Dennis was using his tenants' own money, their security deposits, to secure the very loans that funded his predatory property acquisitions. He was literally banking on their displacement. Worse, the audit trail showed that when a tenant was illegally locked out and left, Dennis would simply claim they'd abandoned the apartment, forfeiting their deposit. He would then use that forfeited cash to pay down the loan he'd taken out against it. It was a closed, vicious circle. Tenant money funded the machinery of their own eviction. This was no longer just housing court fraud. This was wire fraud, securities fraud, and a massive criminal conspiracy. Lynn immediately called the lead prosecutor, who called the FBI. While Dennis was preoccupied with his smear campaign, federal agents were quietly opening a parallel investigation. They subpoenaed the bank records of all 42 LLCs. They began interviewing former property managers, bookkeepers, anyone who had ever worked for Dennis Rourke or Arthur Vance. One of those former bookkeepers, a woman named Maria who'd quit in disgust the previous year, was ready to talk. She met with Rachel and the prosecutors in a secure room. Her testimony was a guided tour of a criminal enterprise. She described spreadsheets where tenants were color-coded: green for compliant, yellow for complaining, red for problem remove. She described shredding parties after city inspectors visited. And she confirmed the security deposit scheme, providing her own hidden copies of the transfer orders. Armed with this, Rachel did something extraordinary. She petitioned the chief judge of the Superior Court for a rare judicial order: the immediate seizure and temporary receivership of Dennis Rourke's entire rental portfolio. The argument was that the properties themselves were instruments and proceeds of ongoing criminal activity, and that the tenants living in them needed protection from asset stripping or retaliation. At the same time, the district attorney unsealed the new, expanded indictment. The charges now included enterprise corruption, money laundering, and multiple counts of fraud. The press conference was a spectacle. Dennis Rourke, watching from his lawyer's office, saw his face splashed next to the words "criminal enterprise." He grabbed his coat and left without a word. He didn't go home. He drove to a nondescript office building in the financial district, took a private elevator to the top floor, and entered the serene, minimalist office of Arthur Vance. Vance, an older man with silver hair and cold eyes, did not look up from his desk. "You've drawn the attention of the federal government to my business," he said, his voice quiet and terrifying. "You were supposed to be a silent, profitable stream, not a siren." Dennis sputtered, trying to explain, to blame the judge, the system. Vance finally looked at him. There is only one stream that matters now, the one that leads away from me. You will take full responsibility for the operational decisions. You will state that I was a passive investor, unaware of your methods. My lawyers will draft the confession. You will sign it. Dennis stared, understanding his final role, the fall guy. If he refused, Vance had the resources to destroy him utterly. If he complied, he might face prison, but Vance would ensure his family was taken care of. It was no choice at all. As Dennis left, a broken man, Vance made one call to a powerful friend on the state judicial conduct board. The message was simple: Judge Carter is compromised. Her husband's debt creates an undeniable appearance of bias. She must be recused from any case touching my interests, and her fitness to serve must be reviewed. The counterattack was now multi-front: a coerced confession to contain the damage, and a judicial ethics complaint to remove Rachel from the battlefield. The war for the courthouse had begun. The judicial conduct hearing was not held in a courtroom, but in a sterile conference room. 3 senior judges, appointed from other districts, formed the panel. Arthur Vance's accusation was the centerpiece. Judge Carter could not be impartial because her family's finances were entangled with the defendant's business interests. Rachel's defense was not delivered by a lawyer but by herself. She stood before her peers and presented a timeline. She showed the Christmas Eve lockout. She played the recorded call where Dennis's lawyer offered to wipe out Michael's debt in exchange for dropping the case. She entered the audit findings into the record, detailing the security deposit fraud scheme. The appearance of bias, she stated calmly, was manufactured by the defendants as a weapon after their illegal actions were discovered. To recuse myself would be to reward criminal behavior and paralyze the court in the face of corruption. The panel deliberated for less than an hour. Their decision was unanimous and blistering. Not only was there no grounds for recusal, but the attempt to manipulate the judiciary through false ethics complaints itself warranted a referral for investigation. Arthur Vance had overplayed his hand spectacularly. With the judicial threat neutralized, the legal machinery ground forward with finality. Facing the mountain of evidence from the audit and the testimony of his former bookkeeper, Dennis Rourke took a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to enterprise corruption, multiple counts of illegal eviction and fraud. In exchange for his testimony against Arthur Vance, he was sentenced to 7 years in state prison. All his assets, including the 42-building portfolio, were forfeited as proceeds of crime. The portfolio was placed into temporary receivership, managed by a nonprofit housing organization. Every single tenant received a formal notice. Their leases were secure. Rents were rolled back to legal, pre-gouging levels. A massive repair program, funded by the seized assets, began in every building. Arthur Vance, believing himself insulated, fought the federal charges. He hired a fleet of high-powered attorneys. But the testimony of Dennis Rourke, combined with the forensic paper trail from Maria the bookkeeper and the banking records, was too much. The jury found him guilty on all counts of conspiracy, wire fraud, and money laundering. The man who operated from the shadows was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. His financial empire unraveled. His assets seized to pay restitution. The final, surprising detail emerged during Vance's asset forfeiture. Buried in his holdings was not just the student loan debt, but a predatory loan servicing company that targeted graduates of historically black colleges and universities. The debt held over Michael Carter's family was not an accident. It was part of a targeted business model. This revelation added a civil rights dimension to the case, triggering a separate statewide investigation into predatory lending. With the criminal cases concluded, the civil front delivered the lasting change. Using the precedent set by the audit, the City Council passed the Tenant Financial Transparency Act, requiring landlords to annually disclose where security deposits are held and prohibiting their use as loan collateral. The state legislature amended the penal code, making illegal lockouts a felony with mandatory minimum sentences when children or seniors are present. A multi-million-dollar restitution fund was established from the forfeited assets. Every tenant Dennis Rourke had illegally displaced was tracked down and compensated. Clara Watkins, the elderly woman forced out months earlier, received a check for $50,000 and an apology from the city. Michael Carter's family's student loan debt was purchased by the fund and ceremonially forgiven. On a bright Monday morning, Judge Rachel Carter returned to her courtroom. The docket was different. Not just cases, but a system now armed with new tools and heightened scrutiny. In her chambers, a framed photo sat on her desk. Her family on Christmas morning in that hotel room, a moment of profound violation that had become a catalyst for justice. The story that began with a lock on Christmas Eve ended with the unlocking of a corrupt system. It proved that the law, when wielded with precision and courage, could reach from a freezing hallway all the way to a penthouse boardroom. It showed that the most powerful defense against predation is not just knowing your rights, but having the authority to enforce them for everyone. The case of Rachel Carter versus Dennis Rourke became more than a viral story. It became a legal landmark, a proof of concept that the mechanisms designed to protect tenants could work, even against deeply entrenched power. But its true significance lies in the question it leaves us with. What happens when the victim isn't a judge? The data is unequivocal. Black Americans, despite being less than 20% of renters, face over half of all eviction filings. In housing courts across the country, upwards of 90% of tenants have no lawyer, while 90% of landlords do. The power imbalance isn't just financial, it's baked into the very structure of the system. Rachel Carter had the unique authority to turn a personal violation into a systemic purge. She knew the exact statute, the right emergency motion, the levers to pull. For the millions of tenants without that knowledge, the outcome on that Christmas Eve would have been tragically different. They would have been the ones seeking shelter. This story, then, is a stark reminder of the chasm between having rights on paper and having the power to enforce them. It exposes how predatory operations rely on that gap, targeting those they believe cannot fight back. The reforms born from this case, stricter penalties, transparency laws, tenant restitution funds, are attempts to bridge that chasm for everyone. It also reveals a deeper, more unsettling truth. Corruption in housing is often not a lone wolf, but a network. It connects the slumlord with the silent financier, the illegal lockout with the predatory loan, the security deposit with the high-risk investment. To fight it, you must be willing to follow the money, no matter how high it leads. Ultimately, this is a story about consequence, about a man who believed the rules did not apply to him, who saw a family as a line item to be deleted. His miscalculation was believing that power was only about wealth and intimidation. He forgot that real power can also be found in knowledge, in principle, and in the unwavering application of the law. If you found this story of justice and consequence compelling, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We uncover these hidden battles every single day. Up next, we have two more incredible stories selected just for you about ordinary people who stood their ground and changed everything. Thanks for watching.